My name is Daniel Menter. I am a CTA who has experience working at a customer as a consultant, as a federal consultant, and now I'm back with a customer. And my presentation today is on building flexible flows using Decision Builder and the Dynamic Flow Launcher. So to jump right into our agenda, we're going to be talking about flows, subflows, kind of the differences between them, and then the decision builder, and finally dynamic flow within Flow Designer itself. So jumping right into flow. Flow is really just kind of the reusable business logic that ServiceNow has created sort of to replace business rules in the long term. It's really visualized via the Flow Designer, and there are different trigger types that are available. For our example purposes here, we're going to use the catalog flow trigger, which is basically just means the flow is going to run when we submit a catalog item. And really flows break down to three different types of components: the actions, flow logic, and subflows. And for this, we're going to be using kind of all three of them, but probably not quite as you expect. So let's jump to the next slide. Um, our first example flow that we're going to create, like I said, we're going to be using the service catalog trigger. So kind of when you see this gray box here on the right, I'm talking about the example flow that we're just going to kind of build throughout this presentation. So our next slide, we're going to do the first action within our example flow. And simply put, we're just going to get the catalog variables from an example catalog item that I built. It has one simple field that is just a string field that says asset type. It allows us to put any string in there so that we can run it against our decision tree, our decision builder, and see the result. So simply going to retrieve that one catalog variable so that we can take action on it later. So at this point in time, our example flow looks like this. We have a trigger from the service catalog, and we're retrieving that variable from that catalog item. Next, we're going to jump into talking about subflows. And subflows are going to be important because they are really very similar to flows, and that's really because they are reusable business logic visualized via the Flow Designer. The main difference that we're going to have for subflows is that they have customizable inputs and customizable outputs, which allows us to design different ways to use these subflows in more dynamic ways outside of just the triggers that are defined within the flow types. And the reason that flows and subflows really are so similar is because they're actually on the same table. So if you go to the table sys hub flow, you can see that the only real difference between the flows and subflows is that there's a field on that table called flow type, which determines the flow or subflow. So I have an example here on the left-hand side. You can see the flow type is subflow or flow, and that just allows us to know what we're calling when we're going to use these later in the decision builder. Excuse me. And for our example, what we're going to do is basically create a dynamic approval for our assets based on the type. So we're going to define three different assets approval flows. And the very first thing we have to do, like I said, is define those input and outputs that are strictly for the subflows. So for example, we're going to create an input that is a requested item. It is just going to be a reference to requested item, and we're just going to call it requested item. And then our output is going to be approval, and it's just going to be a string that captures basically the result from the ask for approval action. So this is how we're going to set up all three of our different asset approval subflows that we're going to see in this example. And our first example is the asset auto approval flow. And this flow is simply going to be one that updates the requested item record with the approval time and changes the actual approval field on the record itself so that we're able to capture all those for auditing purposes. And really, we're going to use this asset auto approval for simple assets that we really don't care too much that the asset team doesn't have to do a whole lot for. So for this example, we're going to set auto approval for things like peripherals. So that's, mice and keyboards, things that, asset management really doesn't care too much about those getting as far as like wiping data or returning them or anything like that. Really, asset management is going to be interested in, do we even have one? So the assets are going to be auto approved at that level of care, essentially. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to build a default asset approval flow. And this is going to be for anything that we have interest in tracking, but isn't a really highly involved process, just something that, as long as the requester's manager approves it, we'll be able to use it. So we're just going to simply add the ask for approval action, and we're going to use the requested item that we pass in through the subflow input. And then the output is just going to be the output for the ask for approval action dropped into the assign outputs action within the subflow. And finally, we're going to do our sensitive asset approval subflow, and this is very similar. We're going to ask for approval on the requested item for the requester's manager, and then if approved, we're going to ask for approval for the asset management team so that they're also in the loop and able to do their procurement or whatever else they have to do to lay the groundwork, imaging, what have you. So this is really the setup we have for this example, just three pretty simple approval flows. And with that, we're going to kind of jump out of our example that we're building and jump into Decision Builder and talking about Decision Builder and what it does and how to set it up. So Decision Builder can be launched directly from the nav menu by going to Decision Management, clicking Decision Builder. And if you already have Workflow Studio installed, you can actually just go to the Decision Builder bubble tab button and click on Decision Builder. And when you create a new decision table, all you have to do is give it a name, a description, and you're able to set whether or not the last checkbox there basically creates kind of the similar to catalog builder or knowledge management where you can check out a decision table for editing or not. So allows you to control that so that the functionality doesn't kind of change mid-use on you, and you can kind of edit it while also having a version that is live and still working within the system. So once we create our decision builder, we have to set up inputs. And the inputs really are very similar to like we had on the flow designer, where you're able to give it a name, a label, and then a type. So when we click on the added input, we're able to just select the label, the type, and whether or not it's mandatory. So anything that's mandatory will show up in the flow designer or within, there's a scripted API that you can actually run Decision Builder through as well. If you don't put in a mandatory input, it will yell at you and not allow you to use it. So that is how you kind of control a mandatory input within the Decision Builder itself. The next thing we need to talk about in Decision Builder are the conditions and the results. So conditions and results really are what we're going to do to conditions. We're going to use those to look at and examine the input that we did, and results is basically what we're going to return when that input returns true. So when we click on conditions, we're able to see that we have the ability to give it a name. We select which input from the inputs that we've defined are going to be. And then the default operator is simply a way to say, use this kind of criteria. So the default is going to be is, but you can also do similar queries like you can pretty much in any other condition builder within ServiceNow. Contains, does not contain, is not. All those are available there so that you can do kind of complex conditions within that condition builder. And then the results here, this is where we're really going to do some of the magic for this presentation. And like I said earlier, the flows and subflows are on the same table, syshub flow. So knowing that, if we just select the result table of syshub flow or the flow table, we'll actually be able to return a subflow as data from this decision table. So putting this all together, we can see that our example, I broke my own color code here. This should be gray, but here is an example of the decision table that we're going to use to power our asset approval subflow example. So you can see I set up the asset type for laptop being the sensitive asset approval. Peripherals are going to be auto approved, and then anything else that is not a laptop or peripheral will get the default asset approval flow set down here in the default result. So how do we actually call this from Flow Designer itself? We simply go to the Flow Logic component and scroll down till we find Make a Decision, and we put that onto the Flow canvas. Now, when we do that, there is one thing that I have to definitely make you aware of, and that's the use branches checkbox. And personally, I think this is probably my least favorite default setting in ServiceNow because a lot of people have never unchecked that and really know how to use Decision Builder outside of the branch version. So, with that checkbox checked, when you drop in a decision onto the Flow Designer canvas, you'll get something that looks like this, which kind of takes all the dynamic functionality sort of out of it because you have then a flow branch defined for each of those results. But when we go back and uncheck that box, it'll allow us to just treat this as data kind of on the right hand side of Flow Designer. You'll be able to go and drag and drop it and use it as pills within other actions. So you can see the other thing that is important here is the executions. The first decision that matches, that's kind of how we have this built out, but you actually do have the ability to return all results that match because we kind of build out our decision table to have a sensitive data, a peripheral data, and then everything else just hits the default use case. We're just going to go ahead and leave it as first decision that matches. And then you can see the input type that is defined down here. We simply drag and drop the variable that we set up in step one of the actions and put the actual asset type from the catalog item directly into this decision builder. And here is what our example flow looks like currently. So we have that service catalog trigger. We have the variable where we get the catalog asset type from step one, and then we're feeding that into the decision table in step two. Now that we have that set up, we can go ahead and talk about dynamic flow and how it's going to function here. So dynamic flow is also available through the flow logic components. Scroll down to see dynamic flow and just go ahead and select that and drag it onto the flow canvas. And then once you get to dynamic flow, you probably get to this screen and are a little confused by what it means when it says flow template, because when you click onto that drop down, it really looks like it's just providing you a list of all the flows. And that really is because that's exactly what it is doing. Flow templates really are kind of not really well defined within the platform, telling you what this means when you're selecting it. So if you go online and look up the documentation, you can find that a flow template is really simply just a flow that has an input that has a matching name and label field values for the inputs. So anything that we created, like all the approval flows earlier, had requested item as an input, and it was the same name and label for each of those. So any of those three approval flows that we created can be used as a flow template. We just have to go ahead and select one. So for this use case, right? So this was what I was talking about here. All the names and labels are requested item here. They are all of the same type. So all of those match and would be allowed to be used as a flow template. So because we have to pick one of the three, I just went ahead and picked the default asset approval flow as the flow template, but we really could use any of the three here. Just kind of a naming convention to use the default one so that we kind of have an idea of what the baseline inputs and outputs would be by looking at that. So once we go ahead and select our flow template, we can see that there is a couple other fields that show up. So initially, flow will be on the dynamic flow action. But once we select the flow template, we can see at the bottom there, requested item actually showed up as well. And that's because it's pulling that from the actual flow template itself so that we can fill that in from the actual beginning of calling this item. So in order to fill this out, we have to put in two pieces of data, a flow and the requested item. And this is where I was talking about getting rid of branches earlier. If we go over to our right-hand side in Flow Designer, we're able to see the decision table results, dig into the results elements, and then finally dig into the actual approval flow that is returned from that decision table itself. So we simply grab this approval subflow reference and drag and drop it into the flow mandatory variable here in the dynamic flow action. And then similar to the requested item, we're just going to go ahead and drag our trigger record into the requested item variable there, and that will pass it into our subflow. So what our full flow looks like right now is this. So we have our service catalog trigger. We are pulling our variable of asset type from the service catalog item. We're passing that into the decision table to pull out the specific approval subflow that applies in that use case. And then we're calling that approval subflow using dynamic flow. And then finally, what our example flow is going to look like is this. Pretty similar for probably most approval flows that you've ever seen. So we get the results from the actual dynamic flow here because we have the action waiting for flow. Once this dynamic flow completes, we'll be able to look at whether or not the approval record is actually approved. And if it is approved, we are going to update that requested item record. And in this case, I just added small updates that told us what flow actually ran so that we can see it as an example here. So I went ahead and submitted 3 different catalog items with different asset types, and we're going to walk through each one so that we can see it. So the first asset type that I did was computer, and you can see up here that it ran, and then down here it's saying that the asset type that ran was computer, and that the result returned was the default asset approval flow, which checking back with our decision table, that is what matches up. We had laptop, peripheral, and then default. So computer is neither laptop or peripheral, so it ran the correct flow. And then if we look here, we have the example for laptop, and we can see that, again, the asset type was laptop, and that the dynamic flow that was launched is actually the sensitive asset approval flow. And finally, we have our example for peripheral, and similar to that, and just tells us what the asset type is, and that the asset auto approval flow was the flow that was launched by the dynamic flow designer or flow launcher. And then finally, to kind of wrap this into the promise of this presentation's access management component, I kind of had to go through some asset management examples, just kind of easier an example, I think, to do just for showing that. But access management is actually possible too. And this is sort of how I have one set up that I've built out. So we have an approval flow, which those are going to be very similar to the 3 flows that we kind of just went over and built out. They're going to take in a requested item, and then they're going to basically run some approval logic based on whatever the identity management use case is. So for example, if we're doing something that is ServiceNow admin access, that might go to the ServiceNow platform owner or the ServiceNow admin group manager. And once they approve, that person will then go into the fulfillment subflow. And the fulfillment subflow will probably be for something like within ServiceNow. We just add them to the actual ServiceNow admin group with a group membership record. And then finally, we have a removal subflow. So for kind of the inverse use case of granting access, we can remove access using the removal subflow. And that would simply be, for the ServiceNow admin use case, we would go in and delete the group membership record for the ServiceNow admins group. But we can also do different automation as your instance has available. So I have in the past set these up to do Active Directory groups, intra groups, different things with Workdays and Salesforce. It really just depends on what automation you have available so that you can set these up. Generally approval groups, the approval subflows, those are going to be probably pretty limited. They're generally going to be, ask for this specific manager, ask for the manager of the requester, or what have you. But the fulfillment subflows and the removal subflows, that's where you can kind of get a lot of different interesting use cases. And having them all in this decision, or sorry, this table will allow you to kind of manage them all and see what is running, what's related to all these different things. And it actually allows you also to kind of build the system robustly so that there are defaults in the use case that you have an access that gets pulled into production and is available within request forms. And then when you combine this with things like variable sets on different catalog items, you're able to do really neat things like add this to your onboarding or offboarding forms while also having different access request forms or access removal forms that actually run the same logic in the background. It's just all called through the active, making a decision and then running the dynamic flow. So it allows you to get a lot of reusability out of these subflows and also kind of just load this table up to be able to see um, what is doing what for whatever access that you have. Um, and so that is really all I have for today. I guess I have time for questions if anybody's available. All right, I'm just checking through chat to see some of the questions that we have here. So one of the questions is talking about the decision tables and how they work, whether or not they consume custom tables. And actually, they are exactly like what you said, M2M tables, or even uh, what are some of the other smaller tables that essentially it's built to consume those tables. So they actually don't count against your license to create decision tables. So you're able to actually build pretty much as many of those as you want. Um, And I also agree there could be some more granular control that is created for decision tables, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of in the works. Decision tables have come a long way from their first implementation. Originally, they were only able to return like a single result, and it had to be a very defined type. And now they're pretty much at the point where it's pretty dynamic, and you can have a lot more results. You can return JSON objects if you want. Um, and yeah, pretty much for this use case, you could pretty much set up anything that has kind of reusable flows or anything that will launch, multiple different kind of like here's an approval sub process, here's a fulfillment sub process, here's a removal sub process, or here's like an update sub process. So I've used this in identity and access management and asset management. I've used it for actually filtering CIs through extending the out of box service now, like TeamDB utils. So there's a lot of different use cases for Decision Builder. It's just a very dynamic tool that you can do a lot with. All right. Well, I think that's all I have for you guys. Thanks for everything.